I grew up in the fringes of the oil business in Tulsa. Tulsa called itself the oil capital of the world in the 1950s, and it wasn't real far off. It was very central to a lot of oil companies and oil equipment and the rest. And most people in business, a very large share of them, were in the oil business in one way or another. Well, so anybody who's familiar with the oil business knows that up until the early 20th century, you could only get gasoline from a tiny share of petroleum. But first with thermal cracking, and then in the 30s, catalytic cracking, you could use much larger shares, 70, 80% maybe of oil, to produce gasoline. And it was that expansion of the feedstock that made possible the transportation revolution of the early 20th century. There's a reason gasoline was 25 cents a gallon when I was growing up in Tulsa. Detroit doesn't produce oil, right? And the United States produces some oil, certainly, and we're going to need oil for a long time. But if we can get to a lot less oil than we have now, we can do something very important. I'll give you one example. Annie Coren of IEGS, a think tank in Washington that promotes working on energy for national security purposes, says that up until the late 19th, early 20th century, salt was a strategic commodity. There was no other way to preserve meat. Preserving meat was hugely important for the human diet, huge share of the human food chain. So people who had salt mines and countries that had salt mines were really important. Believe it or not, countries fought wars over salt. That changed with refrigeration. Now, we still use salt. Probably we still use it some to preserve meat, but mainly we use it for flavoring in one thing or another. Unless you are intimately familiar with Morton's, you probably don't have any idea where it comes from. You don't care. It's bought and sold on a market. It's a commodity like a lot of other commodities. But nobody is going to order you around because he's got salt and you don't. Well, we need to do that to oil. We need to destroy not oil, but we need to destroy it as a strategic commodity. So we don't need it for transportation. There are real competitors, and the competitors, electricity, alternative fuels together in some combination, can get the job done. At that point, oil becomes like lots of other commodities. And by the way, it becomes much more operative in a free market, because what you have now is not a free market. OPEC runs it, a cartel, and they are able to run it, with Saudi Arabia leading it, because it's a strategic commodity and there's no other way for most people and most structures in the world to propel their vehicles around, except with the petroleum-derived fuels. If we can end that, so there are some competitors that are close to oil's cost, like cellulosic ethanol, and others, like electricity, that are much cheaper. People are still going to want oil. Depends on how cheap it is, whether they use oil or natural gas in the chemical plant, etc. Fine. Don't want to destroy oil. Want to do to it what refrigeration did to salt.